I'm Jonathon Hinchley, full stack software developer, software engineer. Everyone uses different titles these days. I've been programming for about 10 years, professionally about six. And what I saw the need for Pieces was just kind of like an AI tool to kind of rival that of like GitHub Copilot, right? Because like a lot of what I do is building websites for people, right? Building APIs for people. And often what I use AI assistance for is like writing unit tests, right? So I write a component, I write an API, and then I kind of am like, hey, I want to write some unit tests. And so I'm asking the AI questions about how do I do that? So, oh yeah, a lot of what I do is website development, APIs, talking to databases, and then I'm also a bootcamp instructor. So
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Tell me about, your tech stack. Like, what are the IDEs that you normally use, languages that you commonly work with, any other tools that you want to mention?
sure. The main two editors that I use are Visual Studio Code and then Visual Studio, the enterprise license. Typically, when I'm in Visual Studio Enterprise, I'm using .NET, so C Sharp. Sometimes there's some SQL stuff in there based on kind of how complex is it, right? Like that's why that editor is really great. It's very powerful, but because it's powerful, it gets in your way sometimes, right? So I like to use Enterprise for when I'm doing like my API level stuff, right? Because I need to write you know really strong unit tests that, run against a in-memory database, right? So I'm spinning up a MongoDB database in memory, running tests against that, and then saying, hey, this test passes, therefore the API is correct, right? So I'm proving correctness. There's a lot of what I'm doing with API development, which is why it's so useful to have tools that help me do my job better, right? It's not do it for you, Jonathan. It's I want tools that say, I'm here if you need me. It's, a little tab waiting for me to click on, and then I can, take what I need and it runs silently without me needing to do anything. The front end tech stack that I use is React mainly. So JavaScript frameworks, HTML, CSS, that kind of stuff. Don't really mess with React Native. Just not a mobile dev, right? So I kind of stick to website development, very, very slim kind of stuff of, customer facing pages. Uh, Recently been working on a client doing like some Next.js stuff, right? So some of like server side rendering stuff. But it's, a lot of React stuff is my front end tech stack. And I tend to go Visual Studio Code on that because it feels a little lighter weight. And often when I'm doing front end stuff, I'm doing a lot of changes or I'm comparing two files and I find that interface a little bit easier on my eyes. And so that kind of leads into maybe we can talk about where the AI kind of plays into that spot of when you're using multiple editors, what do you do?
I'm curious what you did before Pieces. So, are there any tools that you use to manage code snippets or, other generative AI tools or any AI at all in your workflow previously?
Sure. I'll simplify like the 20-minute workflow into 2 minutes, which is what Pieces did. So let's talk about that. So previously, what I did is I would use like ChatGPT, GitHub Copilot, and I would like take that stuff, put it into a Git because like I want to be very clear. So when you work for an enterprise, you need to be very clear like where you get code from, right? So like what's like who built it, right? Who wrote it, right? You can't just go pay some random contractor without permission, right? Because there's privacy concerns, security concerns, dependencies that you have to be aware of. And so what I would do is I would put in like a gist. So I'd be like, hey, I got this cool, interesting thing. Um, when you're doing unit tests inside an enterprise, inside of Copilot, that data is kind of like bound, like that LLM is bound to that organization. So that was reviewed by like the IT people. So I was allowed to use Copilot. But then when I would like switch between Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, Copilot doesn't really work that great in Visual Studio. I think it's because like the RAM and everything, there's just too much going on with Visual Studio Enterprise, and Copilot is just getting like lost in like IntelliSense was trying to run. I just had a bad experience with that. And so I was like, I'm doing all this work. And then, when I found out about Pieces, I was like, oh, I can have one tool to do all of my like AI help stuff. That was really nice because I can be like, oh, it's one tab. And I'm sure all the other developers in the world have two monitors, right? I'm just like, well, it just stays on my left monitor that I'm looking at. I can be like, hey, I don't need to think about it. I can just I like it's never closed on my desktop anymore. It just stays open quietly, I think it's like under 4 meg of memory. So I don't even think about it, right? Because I have like 20 gigs or whatever. So it just runs in memory and I don't think about it anymore. It's just like, oh, I used it.
That's awesome. So did you find, you mentioned some inefficiency with GitHub Copilot. I want to just dig into that just a little bit. Was it a memory thing with GitHub Copilot, or was it sort of a lack of context switching between those two apps?
Yeah, it's a lot of the context switching. I mean, I still use like when I was using Pieces, I've been using on my personal machine because I have to figure out like what is the enterprise policy I'm using Pieces, but like I'm doing a lot of my own personal development outside of the enterprise, right? And so using that there, I found I'm not even touching, right? I'm not even touching Copilot in my personal use, right? Like, you can have a GitHub license and I'm like, I don't even touch it because I'm like, well, I'm switching editors so much. I have SQL stuff that I'm writing. I have Mongo stuff that I'm writing. And it's just like, I can't be everywhere at once. I need one place to kind of be like, hey, and one of the things I used it for was Docker, right? So I was writing a Docker file, right? Of like, hey, I want to build up this API as a Docker container. And I had forgotten. So like there's like port mapping. So you have like a host machine and a client machine. I had forgotten which side was the host and the client. I was like, huh, I wonder if Pieces knows. I just typed it in. And I was like, yeah, that's the one. I was like, cool, thank you. So it's like little efficiencies like that where like you don't really know all the things you need. It's just kind of like I have one step shop. I don't have to remember a hotkey. I don't have to remember which editor do I have open because like now everything looks so similar of Visual Studio and Code. I'm kind of like I'm switching between the two, and I forget like a keyboard mapping that I'm using, and I'm like, ah, that's annoying. I want just ideally one editor, but when someone does it better, you use the tool that's better. So, and it
So
was
it's
just
just
it was
sort of
just frustrating, right? Switching all the time. So,
right, right. And you just sort of need that companion by your side that's like, okay, I have a quick question. I'm not going to go and call up my teammate or something right now. I'm going to first try to use AI to just, solve the question, move on with my day.
right. Well, and a lot of my questions as kind of like a mid to senior level contributor is that I know most of what I need to do. It's just like syntax things will get in your way of you're just doing code and you're like, oops, I forgot how to do, the port mapping for that example, or, hey, help me write some unit tests because this file is 900 lines long. And we can talk about that feature of Pieces of like, I can take a context aware and really give that well. And we can talk a little about how Copilot doesn't do that well. Cause that's one thing that really was frustrating me with I'm between two laptops here and I'm like, I have Pieces on the one. And I'm like, "Huh, I look forward to developing. And then the other one, I'm like, dang, when I gotta write unit tests over here, I'm not looking forward to this because I have to do more of the work."
That's awesome. So which you talked a lot about Copilot. Was that one of the main features that stood out to you when you first downloaded Pieces? Like, tell me about your initial impression.
Yeah, so I'm part of there was like a pilot of GitHub Copilot, pilot of GitHub Copilot, that's redundant, at my enterprise that I work at. And what they were looking for is like, how do we use, like, what is the use case for Copilot as developers here? You have open license, use it however you want, just make yourself more productive. That's the ask. And so one of the things I found is I don't really trust AI often to write code for me. I want it to say, hey, I already know how to code this. How do I test it? Right. So I'm really looking for, did I miss any scenarios? Right. So like, let's say I'm building an API to get the candies, and I'll talk, I have this example pulled up if we want to look through it. I want to get the candy stores in my like vicinity on Halloween, right? Where's the best candy spots to go to? And so I want to know the use cases of what scenarios could someone call that endpoint with and say, okay, I know how to code that. But when it comes to testing an API, it gets very complex. And so that helps me isolate the complexities in the AI and have a conversation about it. And can I get into like what GitHub Copilot is doing wrong? Sure. So
Yeah.
when I
Yeah.
already have like I often already have some test coverage that I just naturally write it because it's so easy, right? It's just like boilerplate stuff, which I could generate with AI, but I just do it by habit, right? Because I have other examples of the project to look at. So I like would generate some like boilerplate stuff of just like the happy path test cases. And then I was like, okay, show me the non-happy paths, right? Of the error handling ones, the things that, where a QA is, quality engineer is trying to put a square peg into a round hole. I want those test cases because as a developer, my focus is on delivering value. And I want the AI to help me realize the pieces I've forgotten, right? I want it to remind me almost of like it's an assistant, right? I have a million things going on in my brain. Hey, Jonathan, you have a meeting coming up at 2 p.m. Hey, Jonathan, you've got a meeting coming up at 4. But when we put it in the context of a developer, hey, did you look at this test case? Right. And I can ask it a conversation. And when you do it with GitHub Copilot, it would replace my code. It would erase chunks of my already stuff that I've done. I was like, no, no, no. Like I would like restrain it. I was like, please suck. I would get annoyed. And I was like, please GitHub Copilot. Don't delete my code. Create net new code. Do not modify existing code. And so that was frustrating is like the AI was confused because it doesn't know the context, right? It only knows, give me a unit test that filters the candy locations by state or whatever the parameter was. And I want to assert that a certain set of candy locations haven't been returned, right? That are not in that state. And so that would be an example of a test case I would write. And that was kind of like how I was thinking of it is, hey, I don't want you to modify my code. And because pieces is separate, it's not modifying code. It's in the snippet. That's, you know, and I can kind of be like, oh, I have this snippet. And then just the ability to save. Like that was huge because like I do a lot of code where I can reuse large chunks of it. And so like, you really optimize one piece of code and then just like over and that's why I was using the GIST before, right? I would just dump it into a single page repo or in GitHub and say, hey, I need it in there. Let me grab it. So long answer, but it's a little frustration that turns really large when you're trying to code things very quickly and deliver fast.
Yeah, and you make a really good point. As a marketer, I'm often looking for keywords that people search often as it relates to AI and the solutions that they're looking for. And we want to, obviously create content so that people can find our site and understand, how our product might fit into their workflow. And one of those keywords that are very commonly searched are AI code generation tools. But for many developers like yourself, it sounds like you're more interested in the question answering aspect of it. And that's not as commonly searched, but it's something that is one of those background services of AI that really helps developers just figure out, solve problems quicker and just sort through the massive amount of code that they get on a daily basis, as opposed to generating more, which is a bottleneck in and of itself. And so, I'm curious on the generation part that you just mentioned and how saving helps you in that area of your workflow.
Sure.
So, do you find yourself often generating code and immediately saving it and coming back to it later, or do you save it, use it right away? Tell me about how that fits into your workflow.
Sure. The only thing like ever truly from scratch generate with AI is like test data. Like that's like I'm like, give me a list of JSON data with objects inside of it that match this kind of thing because it's faster than me mocking something up by hand and I'm gonna freaking a semicolon or something trying to just build 100 records of pizza data or whatever, right? And so often what I'm generating is kind of like that fill in the blank, right? Of like, I know exactly what I want to do and it's prompt engineering, right? I'm like, hey, I know exactly what I'm looking for here. I've already written the code or maybe it's like that conversation. So I really have found the way I've been using AI is I have a problem. Sometimes I'll be like, okay, let me try to describe it of like, okay, can I describe the problem in a way an AI can understand? So say, okay, I want to build a React component to render candy locations on a map. Okay. And so there's like, okay, what's going to be the really easy piece that Jonathan can just do in like 5 seconds? I don't even need to ask the AI. Okay, there's documentation. But then we get into like, okay, if we start looking at pieces for saving snippets, right? The browser extension. You add the browser extension to your browser, which I actually did last weekend. I wasn't really using that feature. You go on the map page and you're like, hey, I'm using Mapbox and I forgot how to, what is it like there's like a little pointer marker thing that you put down of like, so you have the map that loads and then you have the things that overlay on top of like, this is where Pizza Hut is, or this is where the candy is. And so So like those markers, you forget the syntax because you just have so much going on in your brain. Save it to pieces under a certain idea, and then you can go search, hey, I need to put a marker, and you can use AI to search those collections, right? So like that's the beauty is I don't have to remember all the things, you know, across everything, right? I can just be like, oh, it's in there, right? So
So just for context for the viewers, like, is this candy problem just something that you're often using as an instructor in one of your, classes or something?
sure. So let me back up a little bit. So like as an instructor, right, what you're often trying to do is you're trying to take some learning objective, right? And you're trying to take what the learners already know and map it onto something that they don't know. So this candy locations is not something I use a lot, but it was Halloween when I did the webinar. And so kind of pulling from that thing that I did. And I was like, oh yeah, this is a project where what happens if we go in here and we're gonna, if we do the demo, hey, what kind of test could this generate? What would this look like? Right. As if I was using this today for the first time, right? Anyways, so in that problem, right, what I was trying to teach them was like GitHub action pipelines to deliver value faster. So to say, okay, I need to deploy this thing consistently to an app service in Azure. How do I do that? Right. The learners already know APIs. They already know Azure. They already know databases, right? What they need to know is how do I build a pipeline to deliver the value? And so the candy makes it a very easy idea to think about, right? Of conceptually, everyone loves trick or treating. I built you an API to give you the best houses to go to, right? And then that way it gives you a very simple way to think about the problem is you don't have to know the domain of candy. Everyone knows their favorite candy, right? So
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks for the context. Um, cool. Yeah. And so, I'm interested in this specific use case. So you're often creating these sort of tests for your students, and then are you giving them the entire application and then asking them to create these unit tests based on that? Or
Sure. So the unit test is more for my enterprise work. For the boot camp, where I see pieces really valuable, it's that conversational aspect, right? So I have another example of where I use like the OCR, where you take a screenshot and then you like put it into the AI, and we can go into that of like how do I work with the students? Like I haven't done it with the student, but like I have the idea of doing it with students in the future of like this is how you could use AI with the students because I mean, I've definitely seen students use ChatGPT and they create things that hallucinate, right? So it's known to hallucinate things and not always give you the truth, right? And so what I really like to advocate is for students to learn, right? To problem solve. And what I'm trying to teach them is if you're going to use AI, don't use it to write the code. Use it like I am of maybe it's unit tests, maybe it's mock data, maybe it's a conversation where you say, I wrote this, and that's one of the examples I was going to take you through is I have a little, it's a movies endpoint, right? I took a screenshot of it and said, okay, let's have a conversation about this endpoint. And to me, I as the instructor already know Node.js. I already know Mongo. But if the student doesn't, they don't know why they wrote that bug. They don't know why they did the error handling the way they did. They just saw someone else do it on Stack Overflow or in class, or maybe they caught, you know, 80% what a Jonathan was talking about and 20% of it went out the other ear. Right. And so what you're trying to do is teach them that where I'm not going to be there after you graduate my boot camp, right? I'm going to be working on another boot camp or another project, right? I can't be there holding your hand all the time. And so I need you to be able to problem solve. And using ChatGPT doesn't give you that problem solving skill set. You've got to put your hands in the water and swim, right? You've got to start doing it, even if you're doggy paddling at the beginning, right? You're pulling, pulling yourself through the water. And that's how I saw it is it's a conversation, right? So we can look at that snippet if we want to of it's just a movie's endpoint of it just gets movie data from a collection of movies in Mongo. And I really narrowed the scope down as much as I can for a very short demo on that. But it's up to you how much of those demos we want to go through.
yeah, well, so just broadly, how does pieces fit into that specific workflow?
For like working with students.
Yeah, like them learning about the code, problem solving. Like, is it the fact, the retrieval augmented generation where it's learning from your workflow? Is it the ability to, right click on a repository and understand the whole thing and ask questions about it? How do you use it specifically, and how do you envision your students using pieces to learn faster and more efficiently?
Yeah, so the working with actual students with it, there's like approval things that would have to happen before I could. But the way I think about it is like, okay, imagine we're doing a pull request, right? Like to merge their code into the repository, and we're saying, hey, what is wrong with your code? Right. So like it's like having a Jonathan there and saying, let's look at your code together, whatever the student's name is, and let's have an objective eye towards what is this code doing. Right. So hey, pieces, explain this code to me. Hey, pieces, how does error handling work? Right? Because in the real world, right, those are questions you have to ask yourself. You have to understand it. And so when you're a student, it's a really great tool. I just haven't been able to get permission to implement it yet. I want to. Obviously, there's, concerns that, the boot camp has. But that's kind of the conversation, right? Is like you want to have them thinking of what kind of questions would Jonathan ask, right? If I was in a one-on-one conversation with them, I'd be saying, okay, why is your code not working? Right? Well, okay, it threw this error message. Ask, ask the AI, what does this error message mean? Help me understand why is it breaking? And then say, okay, if you don't understand that, okay, start from square one. What does this controller endpoint do? What data does it return? Okay, now that we're returning the data, did you serialize it correctly? So you're really like taking them through step by step, but instead of having to be one-on-one with an instructor, you're enabling them to swim, right? I want to be able to teach them how to learn how to learn, right? I want you learning on your own because that's what I'm doing, right? Like I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. And what you find is I do a ton of just on the spot learning of, oh, that's how something works. Cool. Like the other day, it's not coding related. I didn't know what like the fiscal year was, right? So it was like FY25 Q4. I didn't know why it was 25 for the longest time. And it's because it's the year that it ends in. And so you're like, that makes a lot of sense. I would never do it like that as a programmer. That's a silly way to do it. You do it where it starts, right? Like why would I care where the fiscal year ends? That doesn't like it's kind of like an array, right? Like I don't care where you end. I just care where you start. And I can tell you the length, right? The length is constant. It's always 12 months, right? The quarter is 12 months, right? Or the year is 12 months. So you learn things like that. And you're like, oh, like out of the blue, I didn't understand that the default behavior of some controller is to serialize as JSON. I wanted to serialize as XML for whatever reason. How do I do that? Right. And so it starts that problem solving process. It's still training wheels in my mind, but I think that's useful, right? When you're still new to development, having a set of training wheels is fine, right? Like there's no shame in it, right? Hey, we all started on training wheels on a bike. What's wrong with starting with a more complex task with training wheels, right? Let a computer explain what the computer is thinking, right? Honestly,
Yeah.
I
Do you think that the AI tools like Pieces are changing the way that you teach and the way that students learn? I mean, a lot of it is becoming, I need to know how to problem solve and know how to ask the right questions.
sure. I think it's changing everything. So let's focus in on the teaching, and then I'm gonna talk about how I think it changes everything. So it's changing me. Of I'm trying to give them the answers and the tools to point them in the right direction rather than just giving you the answer outright. I want to give you the steps to get the answer, right? So that's how I start thinking about teaching is I can give you the answer of, okay, on line 4, you are not, you're not handling the status code correctly. You're just doing a try catch and you're catching all errors in that block, which means if you have like a validation error, right? So for example, the client sent you the wrong shape of data. It's supposed to be a triangle. You gave me a square, right? You get, hey, you didn't check whether or not it was a triangle or a square, right? And so it's just going to go into that 500 block and say, oh, 500. But the client is the one who messed up, right? So like helping students understand how to look for those things, you start with, okay, do you actually understand what this code is doing? That's the like to me, that's the first step. And that's how I've always kind of taught. But like I think what AI is enabling us to do is to say, hey, start asking the question the way a human would, and then start slowly building your understanding of how the computer is thinking, right? So, hey, I don't know why the computer is thinking this way, but I can start mapping my understanding to that, right? Pipelines are a great example of that, right? How everyone does like YAML with has like all this spacing and stuff to it has like spacing has meaning in YAML. It doesn't make sense to humans because we're like, oh, like it should work like it's just white space. Like to us, it's kind of incongruent with our understanding of the world, but to a computer, every symbol means something, right? And so it's helping people understand computers are different than humans, right? Like we're not, you know, a little computer that's, silicone, right? We're not chips of silicone. We're organic beings. And so it's helping you see a computer thinks logically, right? It thinks like systematically. It just does exactly what you tell it to. And so understanding what you told it is the foundation of everything. And so that's where I really think it is helping them understand what they wrote. And then if you look at like coding statistics, like a lot of like the code you interact with is code you're reading. Like you're not actually writing more code, you're reading more code, right? So like on a daily basis, I'm reviewing PRs from other developers, right? I'm reading documentation, which has code snippets in it. I'm looking back 3 weeks ago at something I did that no longer is valid. And I'm like, why did I do that? Right. So I see a lot of opportunities where AI can kind of like get into that silo and help share information better. And I think a further thing is like, how do you share that across the entire organization, right? So once you figure out these snippets of, hey, I need to, build a GitHub Actions pipeline like I referenced. Well, once you put that snippet in there, share it with your organization, you really enable some really big like efficiency plays, right? Of, hey, we need this thing in our organization, but we don't want to share it externally. You could put that in a GitHub, but then once you put that in GitHub, well, what happens when it grows, right? Like, how do you search it well, right? Like, how do you have a conversation where you're like, I need this thing. Can you tell me what I'm searching for? Right. Almost. So I think that's where AI plays in like the teaching space is like helping them understand. And then like the broader AI space is, I think a lot of people are going to use it for generation. I think really where it's helpful though is like the assistant we talked about, right? The analogy of, hey, I know exactly what I want to write, but I have too many things going on in my brain. Help me offload some of that to an AI. Like help me have a conversation and they're fun to talk to, right? Like sometimes it has some personality to it. And you're like, oh yeah, like, not a lot's going right today on my API, but thank you pieces for being so kind. Like your grammar is nice. You're not trying to be mean. You're not mad at me. It's really great to just emotionless, right? Like it's just giving you exactly what you asked for, right? And so that to me is part of it, right? It's a assistant or companion that doesn't have emotion. It doesn't get angry. It doesn't get tired, right? If you're like me and you're coding at 2 a.m. in the morning trying to get work done for a client, hey, I need this answer. Wonder if Pieces has it, right? And more often than not, it has it, And I mean, there's some downsides to AI which we can get into, but I see a lot of upside. I think the big downside for me is people kind of just copying and pasting code. Like the thing we mentioned of like students just saying, oh, I can just use ChatGPT to build a controller. I'm like, you can, but if it hallucinates or if you don't understand it, what happens when a client asks you, hey, go build me an API? And now it's something you've never touched before. And is it ethical to use an AI to do that? Right. Then that whole side of ethics come into play. So I think that's the really big downside is the misuse. There's a huge spot for misuse. And so I think that's a bigger conversation, but that's, you know, it's humans, right? Like we're misusing it. It's not AI's fault, right?
Right. Right. I was just gonna ask, what would you say to people that comment on a Pieces ad and say, "Oh, you shouldn't use this because AI doesn't help you learn. You're not gonna learn anything using AI."
Sure. It's a similar thing I tell my students, right? So when you're trying to learn something, right, you could find the answer online almost entirely, right? Nowadays, everything's online. If you want to learn how to ride a motorcycle, climb a mountain, everything's on the internet nowadays. All information that we know we've put on the internet, right? I mean, probably there's people who haven't, but most of the internet's got information for it, right? That's what it's meant for, is sharing information. So when we look at that, why should, if we take devil's advocate of why should you not use AI? Because maybe you're misusing it, right? That would be a good reason not to, is I'm generating code that I don't understand and selling it as my own. That could be a really big argument for not using AI. I don't know how you safeguard against that. That to me is still an open question of how do you safeguard against generated things that I never wrote. But to me, the pros are, well, okay, you're learning. And as humans, right, it's all about community, right? So I have fellow developers, I have mentors like me that are experienced programmers that know what they're doing, know how to communicate to people. And to me, what the really big selling point of AI is that there's a lot of detraction, right? You can say, oh, you're just generating stuff. But the really big selling point is it meets you where you are, right? You don't have to know how to code to start using AI. You can be like, hey, I want to start doing this. And you say, okay, let me go find the create React app tutorial to say, let me go build a very simple React app from the documentation. But now I have pieces with me. Okay, I can start being like, let me ask you this question of why does state work this way? Why does a custom hook work this way? I don't understand what you're telling me. Can you explain it? And then let's say your detraction from AI is, well, it's not going to give you all the answers. Well, what is going to give you all the answers, right? Like it's just trial and error, right? Like learning things as you go, doing enough stuff where you figure it out, right? So, I think that's an invalid argument of you shouldn't rely on pieces to give you everything or AI to give you everything. It should be companionship, right? It's a sense of community, but where the AI is a benevolent thing that has no opinion, right? It's just AI. And the other thing I love is the language thing, right? Like if you can figure out how to ingest, from Spanish or French or German or whatever language, that's all you have to like, that's all you really have to do with AI is you figure out, okay, how do I go from this human language to whatever the AI understands, right? Maybe it's like a, mapping of the word they asked or whatever, right? And say, hey, I understand that human language. I don't have to hire another German programmer. I can say, okay, well, maybe they speak enough English to give their stand-up updates, and that's all we need. And then say, okay, you can use the AI. Maybe it's an assistant to say, okay, there's a language barrier on our team. We need an AI to start being like, okay, we don't have enough resources to support, the people we're onboarding from a different language background. We want to hire them, but like maybe we're a startup. We don't have the funds to just be hiring 100 people that speak the same language. How do you build a community? Well, maybe it's a bunch of AI assistants that speak that person's language. And you can say, hey, it's all the same code, but the human interaction is just an interface, right? Like it's a black box, right? Like you don't have to know how pieces takes from German to English to code or whatever. It just does it, right? Like that's all you'd have to solve, right? And that's the beautiful thing to me is it, it doesn't have a religion, it doesn't have an opinion, it's just code, right? Like that's a beautiful thing, right? It can go across boundaries.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, software development, that's why we're building tools for developers. People love it and they love the code with pieces. You mentioned using AI to understand documentation. And you mentioned that's a big thing as a
Sure.
developer. Have you tried out the Pieces Chrome extension and the
Yeah.
Ask Pilot About, the button that hovers over a code snippet?
Yeah.
And did that work out for you?
I didn't To be honest, I didn't use that piece. I just would be like, I'd be in a train of thought, and I'd be like, "Hey, let me ask it." Like it was like after it's like for me, it's like an afterthought because like my brain is already forming connect like it's my brain's already forming connections itself. And so like what I'm really using pieces for is like when the documentation doesn't give enough information, right? So like if I exhaust the FAQs on the page and I'm like, Microsoft, right? Like I'm trying to do some app service thing on Azure. Why didn't you answer this question that I have of like, okay, how does billing work if, I scaled down the app service, like when does my compute hour end, right? Like how does that calculated so I know when my billing is done because I'm spending, thousands of dollars a month. How do I know where the line is drawn rather than engaging with, Microsoft support? Hey, pieces, is there anything in this, 10 pages of documentation that I missed, right? Because I'm scanning it for keywords of like billing hours and I'm scanning it for compute hours, and maybe the way they worded it in their documentation isn't how I thought about it. But Pieces may maybe look at it and be like, oh, it's using a different word, right? Like a great example, GitHub Actions, one of its syntax is very different from the Azure pipelines. So like there's two different pipeline providers to do deployments to the cloud. The syntax is different enough to where like you forget which one you're in, but at the same time you're like, oh, it's just, it's just a Node.js application. Why is it so different? And the funny thing is Microsoft owns both GitHub and Azure. And so you're like, why are these not the same? Why are these not the same? And so it's really funny when you do that where you're like, oh, why is the documentation for this not good, but on the other one it is, right? You're like, man, that would have been nice to help me. And then the AI comes in and says, oh yeah, Jonathan, this is what it is, right? I just ask it because it can search more things quickly than I can, right? It can search at the speed of compute, right? I can search at the speed of my own comprehension, right? Which maybe is slower than an AI. So can you get the AI building a better question with the thing that you're giving it, right? Is I gave you the snippet of a GitHub action. I'm trying to do this. Can you give me documentation? Can you give me those related articles that point me exactly what I'm looking for? I just couldn't find it myself, right? So it's again, assistant saying, "Oh, hey, you have these things that you didn't realize," right? Which is kind of where the assistant breaks down is often the assistant is more of like a, you know, very, procedural instructions. Whereas the AI assistant can be growth things, right? It can grow your understanding, not just do what you tell it to do. And that's where I like using is to me, that's a really powerful use of it is when I'm growing from it.
What's your overall satisfaction level with Pieces, and would you recommend it to someone else?
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely have questions like with like enterprises, like how that, like how that relationship works, right? Of like, I think that's a complex private, like, like they have concerns about privacy as always. Or like, with the teaching bootcamp, like what is the, you know, with supporting students, like what does that look like? Like I've questions about that. But I think really like the thing that I love is the conversations just feel so natural, right? Like if it feels like I'm talking to another developer the scenes, right? Like is there the Wizard of Oz, pull back the curtain, is there a developer in there? And I'm like, well, and what I did one time is it was like 2 a.m. in the morning. I was like, I wonder. So I just unplugged my Ethernet cord. And I was like, "Yep, it still works." So I've tested it. I'm not going to do it because it'll drop the call. But yeah, I mean that is it's huge to me is the ability to have a conversation like a developer because again we're developers, right? Like we're very intelligent people. We're learning very complex topics, right? Even as new developers, complex topics are there. Um, and I think the key thing here is again what are you trying to get from it? And I think really like you were saying of like how do you market it? I think you market it towards helping people. I think you go away from the AI generated solutions as a off the shelf solution. I don't think marketing towards that is valuable. And I don't think you are. I'm just saying like I think you go towards the it's a companion for you. I think you really play into that because I really think it's a superpower. I really do. Um I could say more, but I think that is the best summary of it is it feels like another developer on the other side of the screen. It really does.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean that's why we called it Copilot, Pieces Copilot. It's
Right.
it is a companion that's sitting right next to you, wherever you are, embedded in your workflow.